They never saw me coming. Not my brother, not my sister, certainly not the lawyers. For years, I was the shadow, the one who took care of Dad, the one they ignored while they counted the money in their heads. That retirement party? That wasn't a party. It was an execution attempt. And the executioner? My brother. He thought he was being subtle, slipping something into my champagne, but I saw the reflection in the glass, and in that split second, the quiet, dutiful sister died, and a new me was born. I switched the glasses. I did it so fast, so smoothly, he never noticed until the poison started taking hold. The inheritance was supposed to divide us. It ended up exposing a monster.
The whiskey glass was still rolling when Mark hit the floor. The irony? It was Dad's favorite Scotch, the one he said was too good for any of us. My brother, my own flesh and blood, was seizing on the floor of the room where we just read our father's last will. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. It was supposed to happen to me. They always thought I was the easy target, the one who just took care of Dad and never fought back. The room immediately descended into chaos, a whirlwind of panicked shouting and desperate movements. My sister, Sarah, screamed, dropping the stack of legal papers she was holding. Lawyers rushed in, phones were pulled out, and the silence that had followed the reading of the will was shattered completely. I stood motionless, leaning against the doorway, a calm that felt alien in the face of such turmoil. I watched Mark's body convulse, a sickening yet strangely satisfying sight. It had all started 10 minutes earlier in the dining room when he approached me with that fake, sympathetic smile of his. He offered a toast, raising his crystal glass to a peaceful transition, but his eyes betrayed his true intentions. That slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he slipped a tiny white pill into my drink. I caught it all in the reflection of the dining room mirror. That simple movement changed everything for me. My mind raced, running through decades of subtle, underhanded betrayals and manipulations they'd pulled on Dad and me. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was an attempt on my life to secure the entire inheritance. He thought he was being subtle, but years of observing his greed had taught me to read every tiny shift in his demeanor. I knew I had to act immediately and without a sound. As Mark turned to address the lawyer, momentarily distracted, I made the move. My hand glided across the polished mahogany table, executing the switch with the practiced ease of a magician. 2 identical glasses, a split-second exchange, and the poison intended for me now rested firmly in his hand. I took a slow sip of the clean drink, making sure my expression remained completely neutral, playing the role of the quiet sister perfectly. I listened to his toast, my heart hammering a dangerous rhythm against my ribs, knowing that every single word he spoke was a lie. He drank his whiskey, completely oblivious to the venom he had consumed, and followed the lawyer into the study, ready to finalize his victory. He never even looked back at me. But the true cost of that sip had yet to be paid. The immediate aftermath was a deafening blend of professional calm from the lawyers and sheer hysteria from Sarah. Mark's wife, Lisa, was completely useless, hovering over him and sobbing loudly, demanding someone tell her what was happening. I noticed the lead lawyer, Mr. Henderson, quickly securing the will and the rest of the documentation. He was sharp. He knew that in a family crisis involving money, the papers were the real prize, regardless of Mark's medical condition. My own pulse was finally beginning to slow down, transitioning from terror to a cold, calculated calm. I had to manage the situation, not just physically, but emotionally, maintaining the facade of the distraught, innocent sister. I rushed to the phone, calling the emergency services with a practiced tremor in my voice. I gave them all the necessary details, carefully omitting the one piece of information that would instantly unravel everything: the poisoned Scotch. While I was on the phone, Sarah dropped to her knees beside Mark, shouting his name over and over again. Her face was pale, but there was a strange, manic quality to her panic. It didn't quite ring true. She was too dramatic, too focused on the show, not on actual first aid. It was another reminder that my siblings were always playing a part, even in moments of genuine crisis. This was all about positioning, even now. I ended the call, confirming that the paramedics were on their way, and gently pushed Lisa aside, offering her a glass of water. It was a simple gesture, one that screamed responsible family member, ensuring that everyone saw me in the correct light. I kept my movements steady, my breathing even, trying to compartmentalize the image of my dying brother from the quiet satisfaction I felt deep in my core. I was fighting for my life, and I had just won the first round. Mr. Henderson approached me, his face etched with worry, and asked a flurry of questions about Mark's health history. I answered truthfully about my brother's past, focusing on stress and high blood pressure, subtly laying a foundation for a natural medical cause. I made sure to avoid any mention of what he had consumed. My story had to be flawless and entirely consistent from this point forward. As the sirens became audible in the distance, cutting through the silence of the large estate, Sarah finally stood up, wiping tears that looked suspiciously dry from her cheek. She surveyed the room, from the fallen glass to the distraught wife, her gaze eventually settling on me. But Sarah's eyes weren't focused on the emergency. They were locked on me.
The paramedics burst into the study, their urgency instantly shifting the room's atmosphere from panicked chaos to professional control. Their questions were direct and relentless. What was the sequence of events? Had Mark taken any medication? Had he consumed anything unusual? I answered each inquiry with the same calm precision, sticking strictly to the timeline of the will reading and the sudden collapse. I made sure to mention the stress of the inheritance dispute as a contributing factor, a subtle hint toward a natural cause. Sarah stood silently beside the paramedics, watching me closely, her expression a mix of genuine concern for Mark and sharp suspicion directed at me. She didn't say a word, but her silence was a louder accusation than any scream could have been. I could almost hear her mind working, trying to reconcile the sight of her brother with the quiet sister she thought she knew. Her gaze was chilling, forcing me to maintain an almost impossible level of composure, knowing any slip could be fatal. One of the paramedics asked about the fallen glass, pointing to the whiskey puddle on the rug. "Did he drink anything immediately before this happened?" he asked, his voice neutral. This was the moment of real danger. I had to address the drink without revealing the switch. "We all had a glass of Dad's favorite Scotch for a toast right before we came in here," I replied, carefully. "He finished his, and then a few minutes later he collapsed." I deliberately included "we all" to imply shared consumption and normalcy. The mention of the Scotch triggered a flurry of notes from the medical team, and I watched them bag the broken pieces of the crystal glass as evidence. It was protocol, but seeing it handled and labeled sent a fresh wave of panic through me. What if they analyzed the residue? What if the amount of poison was traceable? I quickly pushed the thought away, reminding myself that the chemical evidence would only confirm what I already knew. A poison was present, but it was Mark, not me, who had consumed it. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, sensing the escalating tension, stepped in to try to de-escalate the scene. He reiterated the narrative of high stress and family friction, trying to protect the integrity of the will reading. He didn't suspect foul play, but he was keen on protecting his firm's reputation from the taint of dramatic family scandal. His intervention was a brief shield, giving me a moment to breathe and recenter my strategy amidst the mounting pressure. As Mark was finally secured on a stretcher and wheeled toward the door, Sarah broke her silence, her voice a low, hostile whisper meant only for me. "You didn't even cry," she stated, her eyes narrowed. It wasn't a question, it was a cold, hard statement of fact, a challenge. I simply held her gaze, my expression deliberately devoid of emotion. I knew right then that I wasn't just fighting for money, I was fighting for my freedom. With Mark finally gone in the ambulance, a profound, eerie silence settled over the room, broken only by Lisa's muffled sobs. The lawyers were huddled together, clearly uncomfortable and eager to leave the scene of the collapse, which was now potentially a crime scene. I used this brief lull in the chaos to subtly gauge the threat level, noticing that Sarah had positioned herself near the doorway, effectively blocking my easy exit. She was waiting for me, her anger finally overcoming her performative grief. I walked over to the antique writing desk and began carefully stacking the scattered papers, a mundane task that served to anchor me in the moment and project an image of measured control. As I did this, Sarah moved closer, her voice low and sharp, designed to avoid the lawyer's ears. "You saw him fall, didn't you? You didn't even flinch," she hissed, her eyes blazing with raw accusation. It was the first direct verbal assault, and I had to handle it perfectly. "He's my brother, Sarah. I called 911 immediately. What exactly do you want from me right now?" I watched her face carefully, searching for any sign that she suspected the truth of the poisoned drink. As far as she knew, Mark had simply suffered a sudden, severe health episode brought on by stress. She didn't mention the drink, but she didn't have to. "You're too calm," she stated flatly, crossing her arms. "You were the one always complaining about him and his greed. Always the victim. Now he's fighting for his life, and you look like you just won the lottery." Her words were a chilling echo of my inner thoughts, hitting too close to home, but they only confirmed that her suspicions were purely emotional and circumstantial, not based on any hard evidence. I knew this was my chance to turn the tables. I held her gaze, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The will hasn't even been settled, Sarah. Why are you already acting like the sole inheritor?" The question landed like a physical blow, instantly shifting the focus back to her own intense greed. Her composure broke, her mouth dropping open slightly, realizing her own transparency in the face of the family fortune. The brief flash of panic in her eyes was all I needed to have successfully deflected the attack and placed the target firmly back on her back. I knew that to protect myself, I'd have to start digging into their lives before they dug up mine. After the ambulances and the lawyers finally departed, leaving the house unnervingly quiet, I insisted on helping Lisa and Sarah clean up the mess. It was the perfect pretext to remain in the study and discreetly search the area. Lisa was a wreck, still in a state of shock and utterly useless, while Sarah busied herself making urgent phone calls, likely to her own contacts or attorney. Neither of them paid me any mind. They truly believed I was merely performing my quiet, dutiful sister routine again. I began by collecting the remnants of the glass and the spilled scotch, a process that made my skin crawl with lingering fear. The area where Mark had fallen was soaked, and the air still carried a faint, strange odor mixed with the expensive liquor. It was an unusual, almost sickeningly sweet smell, something I couldn't quite place initially. I had to mentally take myself away from the horror of the situation to focus on the technical details of the scene. I quickly remembered a small, almost undetectable detail I'd noticed while pouring the toast earlier. The Scotch bottle had been sitting on the sideboard, but near it, there was a tiny, sticky residue on the mahogany surface, easily mistaken for spilled alcohol. Now, with Mark gone and the light catching the surface just right, I examined the spot closely. The sickly sweet smell intensified, and I recognized it: burnt sugar. Mark had likely used a compound disguised by a syrup or sugar-based solution to dissolve the poison instantly in the dark liquor. It was a careless mistake born of his arrogance. He thought he was home free and nobody would ever look closely enough at the scene. This tiny, sticky spot, barely the size of a dime, was the proof that the collapse was no medical incident, but a calculated and cold-blooded attack orchestrated by my own family. I quickly took a clean linen napkin from a nearby drawer and carefully dabbed the residue, folding the evidence tightly and tucking it into the deep pocket of my dress. I kept my face utterly blank, even as my entire body trembled with adrenaline and silent rage. The thought that Mark and Sarah had been working together to eliminate me felt heavy, but this evidence gave me power. I knew that detail was my golden ticket, the first real leverage I had against their elaborate scheme. I was still wiping the faint, sticky residue from my hands when the phone rang, shattering the relative quiet of the late afternoon. It was the hospital, and the news was grim. Mark was in critical condition, and the doctor suspected poisoning, not just a simple stroke or heart attack. The tone of the conversation was cold and professional, immediately shifting the situation from a family emergency to a serious criminal investigation. My blood ran cold, even though this outcome was exactly what I had intended. A few minutes later, the call I had been dreading came in, this time from a detective at the local precinct. He was politely formal, asking me to come down as a key witness to the incident that took place at the reading of the will. He made it clear he wanted a comprehensive statement, starting from the moment we arrived at the house. This official request confirmed my worst fears. The police were already putting the pieces together, and the scrutiny would now fall on everyone present, including the quiet, dutiful sister. Sarah overheard my end of the call, and her face hardened, a look of pure calculation replacing her earlier panic. She clearly saw the new development not as a danger, but an opportunity to frame me. "You'll tell them about the inheritance, of course. Tell them how much stress Mark was under and how desperate everyone was to get their hands on Dad's fortune." Her implication was painfully obvious. I knew I couldn't afford to play defense anymore. I had to proactively shape the narrative. "Don't you worry, Sarah," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'll tell them everything. About the will, about the fighting, and about Mark and his constant threats to cut people out of the family business." This subtle threat, focusing the police's attention on Mark's aggressive character, was my first countermove, designed to turn the spotlight onto his potential enemies. The detective's request forced a critical realization. The sticky napkin in my pocket was the only thing standing between my innocence and Sarah's desperate accusations. I needed to move that evidence, and more importantly, get it analyzed discreetly. I couldn't risk the police finding it during a potential search, nor could I hand it over to them without losing control of the investigation. My survival now depended on controlling the flow of information. As I left the house, agreeing to meet the detective the following morning, Sarah whispered, "Be careful what you say, sister. Lies have a way of coming back to bite you." I gave her a small, knowing smile in return. The time for playing the victim was over. I needed to prove they were the villains before they convinced the police I was.
My first priority, before even calling the detective, was moving the evidence to a secure location. The sticky napkin, the silent witness to Mark's scheme, couldn't stay in my position for long, and it certainly couldn't be left in the house where Sarah or Lisa might stumble upon it. I couldn't risk it being dismissed as circumstantial or, worse, being found by the police before I could control the narrative surrounding it. I left the study, avoiding Sarah's sharp gaze, and quickly drove to my small, discreet apartment downtown. Once there, I retrieved a clean, airtight glass container, the kind I usually used for food storage, and carefully placed the folded napkin inside. I sealed it tightly, labeling it with a single, cryptic date. The whole operation took less than 5 minutes, but the feeling of having that proof securely locked away was a much-needed breath of fresh air amidst the suffocating stress. The next step was more difficult. I needed to get the residue analyzed without alerting the authorities or giving my family any reason to suspect I was running a parallel investigation. I couldn't simply walk into a commercial lab. My actions had to be above board, but entirely private. I had to tap into my old contacts, the ones I had cultivated over the years while quietly managing Dad's complex financial affairs. I finally settled on calling David, an old college friend who now owned a small, highly respected environmental and chemical testing consultancy. David owed me a major favor from a past business deal, a favor I knew he would be honor-bound to repay without asking questions. I called him from a burner phone just to be on the safe side, using a code word we hadn't used in 2 decades. He recognized it instantly. I arranged to meet David in a neutral location the following morning, right after my meeting with the police, assuring him the sample was highly sensitive and the results needed to be reported only to me.
It felt strange to be setting up a clandestine meeting like this, but I knew my survival depended on it. As I looked at the sealed container sitting innocently on my kitchen counter, I realized my entire future and Dad's legacy hinged on the silent testimony of that sticky linen napkin. I arrived at the precinct the next morning, deliberately dressed in conservative, slightly subdued clothing. I wanted to project the image of a grieving, slightly overwhelmed sister, certainly not a master strategist. Detective Miller, a seasoned woman with a face that gave nothing away, ushered me into a small interrogation room. The environment was sterile and intense, immediately putting my composure to the test. She started the interview gently, asking about Dad's final days, easing into the family dynamics. I answered with controlled emotion, emphasizing my close bond with Dad and the years I spent caring for him. This established my motive as love and duty, setting it against my siblings' clear focus on financial gain. It was essential to paint a contrast before discussing the day of the will reading. The detective then moved to the crucial timeline of the collapse. I recounted the events exactly as they happened, detailing the toast, the reading of the will, and Mark's sudden seizure. I emphasized the high stress and anger that had been simmering between the siblings, making sure to highlight how Mark had been verbally aggressive towards Sarah just an hour before. I was not beating around the bush about the conflict, but directing the focus away from myself. "Did anything strike you as unusual before your brother collapsed?" Detective Miller finally asked, leaning forward, her gaze cold and steady. This was the moment I had to execute the finesse. I paused, feigning a moment of thoughtful reflection. Well, Mark was certainly agitated, but the only odd thing was how fast it happened. One minute he was drinking his scotch, the next he was down. He hadn't been feeling well lately, I know that for a fact. I knew she was fishing for any inconsistencies or signs of suspicion on my part. By confirming the drink, but immediately attributing the collapse to stress and existing health issues, I sealed my narrative of innocent observation. Her eyes remained fixed on mine, searching for any tremor or flicker of guilt. But I held her gaze perfectly. I realized that in this battle for Dad's money, the truth was less important than the story I sold. Immediately after leaving the precinct, I drove straight to the industrial park where David's chemical consultancy was located. The meeting felt incredibly tense, a sharp contrast to the cold formality of the police station. We met in a sterile back office, and I placed the sealed container on his middle table. David, my old friend, just nodded, his expression serious, respecting the gravity of my unsaid request. "This came from a glass of scotch involved in an incident," I explained simply, avoiding the word poison. "I need to know the composition of the residue. Fast. And the results go only to me. Are we on the same page?" He didn't hesitate, just gave a curt, "Got it," and put on his lab gloves. His professionalism gave me a much-needed sense of security. I knew I could trust him to keep a lid on this. I waited anxiously in the quiet room for what felt like an eternity. David finally returned, his face unusually pale. He pushed a printout across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "It's a derivative of a highly toxic nerve agent," he whispered, his eyes wide with concern. "It's not typical rat poison. This is high grade. And the compound used to mix it, that burnt sugar smell, that was a unique, fast-acting binder designed for rapid dissolution in alcohol." The severity of the toxin instantly changed the whole complexion of the case. This wasn't a desperate, last-minute decision by Mark. This level of planning and access suggested something far more sinister and professional. My brother didn't just walk into a store and buy something this potent. He must have had an accomplice with specialized knowledge or very deep, dark connections. But the most chilling part of David's discovery was the specific type of agent. He identified it as a compound that had been restricted
decades ago, primarily used in specialized, highly regulated military and industrial applications. My father, years ago, had briefly invested in a small, obscure chemical manufacturing company, a detail I hadn't thought about in over 40 years. The type of poison wasn't just a detail, it was a signature, pointing directly to a dark corner of my father's past. Armed with David's terrifying analysis, I returned to the estate. Sarah and Lisa were in the drawing room, maintaining a fragile, bitter truce as they waited for updates on Mark. I didn't announce my presence. I simply walked in, my expression a careful blend of exhaustion and newfound quiet steel. I bypassed Lisa, who was too consumed by her own sorrow to be a threat, and walked directly towards Sarah. The police are taking this very seriously, Sarah. They know it wasn't a heart attack. They suspect foul play. Sarah stiffened, but her face remained carefully neutral. The politician's daughter, always prepared to face the camera. Of course they do, she retorted, her eyes narrowing. This whole family is a snake pit of greed. You're trying to shift the blame, aren't you? Trying to make people forget you were the one who always had the most to gain from Mark being out of the picture? I let her finish, then placed my hands flat on the coffee table, leaning in slightly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. It's not about who stood to gain, Sarah. It's about the how, I said, my gaze intense. The police don't know this yet, but I do. The poison Mark used was a military-grade nerve agent, something developed for chemical applications decades ago. It's rare, highly specialized, and not something you buy off the shelf. I watched her face closely. She tried to maintain her composure, but a flicker of genuine terror crossed her eyes. She clearly had no idea the poison was traceable to this degree. I continued, driving the knife in deep, using the knowledge I had spent the entire morning researching after David's call. Remember that disastrous investment Dad made 30 years ago in that little chemical company, Novachem? The one he secretly bought and later quietly shut down after some scandal? That company was the sole regional distributor for this exact compound. The poison in Mark's Scotch has Dad's signature on it, Sarah. Sarah was hyperventilating, struggling to regain her breath after the shock of the Novachem revelation. She frantically looked around the room, making sure no one else had overheard my chilling deduction. The fear was genuine this time. This was about more than just money now. It was about a secret that could destroy the entire family legacy and potentially implicate them both. I waited patiently for her to compose herself, allowing the silence to do the heavy lifting. "What do you want?" she finally choked out, her voice barely a whisper, the previous arrogance completely gone. It was the first honest question she had asked me in decades, and it confirmed that she finally understood the depth of the trouble we were in. She knew that the police connecting the poison to Novachem would be a huge problem for everyone. "I don't want the fortune to expose Dad's past to the world, Sarah," I lied smoothly, appealing to her sense of self-preservation and social standing. "And I certainly don't want a murder investigation hanging over us. We need to control the narrative. We need to work together to figure out who else knew about Novachem, and more importantly, why they thought using that specific poison was a good idea." This was a calculated risk. I was inviting a temporary, highly volatile partnership, knowing that she would try to betray me the minute she felt safe. But she was the last person who had spoken to Mark before the collapse. She was the most likely source for information about his recent movements. I needed to know the details of his plan to poison me, details that she might have inadvertently picked up. Sarah finally agreed, though the look in her eyes was one of deep hatred mixed with desperate fear. She started recounting the days leading up to the will reading, focusing on Mark's obsessive behavior and constant secret phone calls.
She mentioned that Mark had been acting strangely, frequently meeting with someone he only referred to as the specialist, someone who supposedly had a silver bullet solution to our inheritance problem. But I needed to know the one thing Mark would never tell me: who gave him the poison and why. Sarah, desperate to save herself from the Novachem fallout, was now surprisingly forthcoming about Mark's recent activities. She admitted that Mark had been secretive for months, constantly locking himself in Dad's old study and becoming obsessed with shaking me off the inheritance trail permanently. He had apparently found someone who promised to make his problem disappear cleanly, making it look like a tragic accident. He called him Victor, she finally confessed, her voice thick with dread. Mark met him twice in the city. Victor. He's the one Mark kept calling the specialist. She quickly added that she thought Victor was just an overly aggressive business consultant who knew how to manipulate legal paperwork, not a murderer. She was still trying to maintain her own thin pretense of innocence, claiming she never suspected lethal intent. I looked past her lies, focusing on the name, Victor. That detail was concrete, a necessary first step. I pressed her on how Mark had found this Victor, certain that the introduction had to be linked to the Novachem compound or perhaps someone from our father's dark past. But Sarah claimed she was out of the loop on that part. Mark was too arrogant to trust her with the technical details of his grand plan. The more she talked, the clearer the picture became. Mark's greed had blindsided him. He was so focused on getting me out of the way that he partnered with a professional, failing to realize that this Victor was likely using him, and possibly the poison itself, for a much larger and more dangerous agenda. The attempt to kill me was not an emotional crime. It was a cold, outsourced business transaction, making his mistake even more colossal.
My makeshift alliance with Sarah was purely tactical, so I didn't dare share my next steps with her. I knew the moment I turned my back, she'd try to figure out a way to pin everything on me. My immediate, lone mission was to find Victor, or at least a digital trail of him. Mark's secret meetings and birder phones meant my search had to be just as discreet, operating under the radar. I leveraged another old contact, a skilled private investigator named Marcus, whom Dad used for low-level corporate espionage decades ago. Marcus specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. I only gave him the name Victor and the time frame of the meetings Sarah mentioned, emphasizing the need for absolute confidentiality. This was expensive, but in this game, money was just a tool for survival. Marcus got back to me quicker than I expected. He found a recent consulting company registration under the name Victor Sterling. The company itself was new, registered only 4 months ago, just when Mark's obsession with the will started. But the address on the filing was the detail that made my blood run cold. It wasn't an office building. It was a storage facility. But not just any storage facility. It was one of the many shell companies and commercial properties that my father had secretly owned and quietly managed through a complex network of trusts. Dad had always kept a few properties off the books, saying they were rainy day assets. Victor was operating his assassination business literally from one of Dad's properties. This wasn't random anymore. Mark hadn't just hired a specialist, he had hired someone who was already intertwined with our family's hidden financial structure. I realized that the specialist wasn't an outsider at all. He was someone inside the inner circle, cleaning house. I arranged a quick, clandestine meeting with Sarah, choosing a quiet park far from the estate to avoid any lingering eyes. When she arrived, she was even more agitated, clearly feeling the weight of the police investigation closing in. I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. I went straight for the jugular. Victor Sterling is operating out of one of Dad's secret storage units, I announced, watching her reaction like a hawk. Sarah's face drained of color, confirming she knew exactly which properties I meant, the ones Dad had kept off the books. Your specialist wasn't a random hitman, Sarah. He was already part of Dad's shady operation. Now tell me, who introduced Mark to him? She initially tried to boot around the bush, stammering that she had no idea, but the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. I pressed harder, reminding her that if the police discovered Victor's connection to Dad's property, they would uncover the entire history of Novachem, exposing decades of questionable business practices. The threat of public scandal, not justice, finally broke her silence. "It was a ledger," she whispered, looking over her shoulder nervously. "Mark found an old encrypted ledger hidden behind the bookshelf in the study. It contained the details of the Novachem liquidation and a list of contacts." She confessed that Mark had planned to use the information in the ledger as leverage against me and the executors, but he had clearly gotten in over his head. She explained that Mark hadn't just found Victor's name. The ledger indicated that Victor, or someone close to him, was handling the security and maintenance of those secret assets. Mark had seen the ledger not just as a tool for money, but as proof that Dad was running a hidden life outside of his public persona. The thought of this hidden past now being exposed was enough to paralyze Sarah with fear. The revelation of the ledger was a game changer. It meant Mark's motivation was far deeper than simple inheritance. It was about controlling a hidden stream of family income and power. The truth wasn't just about Mark's greed. It was about protecting a secret that could bring the whole family empire crumbling down.
The sticky note was the smoking gun, yet it created more confusion than clarity. The sister knows too much. Accelerate. I hadn't known anything about Novachem or Victor until after the poisoning, so Mark must have believed I knew something, or someone else believed I did. This meant the note's writer was closer to the action than Victor, perhaps directing the entire operation. I grabbed the note and quickly put it next to Mark's handwriting on the ledger's cover I'd briefly seen. The two styles were completely different. I then looked at Sarah, who was leaning against the wall, her face pale. I asked her to write down a simple phrase, claiming I needed to compare Mark's handwriting to hers for the police. As she wrote, my heart hammered in my chest. I compared her hurried, elegant script to the aggressive scrawl on the sticky note. They were not identical, but they shared uncanny similarities, specifically in the way the S and T were formed, a pattern Mark's handwriting completely lacked. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Sarah knew about the murder plot and was actively involved in pushing it forward. Why were you so worried about Unit 4B, Sarah? And why did Mark ask for a security review of that unit specifically? Sarah stammered, denying everything, claiming she only knew about the unit because Mark mentioned it was Dad's most valuable secret asset. I pressed her, reminding her that I had just saved her from being implicated in a capital crime. I finally forced the truth out of her. She didn't just know about Unit 4B. She was the one who was secretly managing it for Dad after he fell ill, thinking she could keep the profits. I looked at the handwriting again, the similar flourish of the pen confirming my terrifying suspicion. I realized with a sickening jolt that the person who signed off on my death wasn't the specialist. It was someone standing right beside me. The truth hung between us, thick and toxic, far worse than the poison that put Mark in a hospital bed. Sarah managed Unit 4B, the core secret, and she was the one who accelerated the murder plot because she feared I knew too much. She wasn't Mark's accomplice. She was the architect. I took a slow step back, putting distance between us, knowing that her fear had just transformed into raw, murderous panic. Her betrayal was complete, and she knew I had pieced together the entire truth. "You wrote the note," I stated flatly, not as a question, but as a final judgment. "You realized Mark was going to botch the job, or maybe you realized he was just going to leave you out of the biggest payoff.
The accelerate note? You ordered my death. Sarah's composure shattered. The sophisticated sister disappeared, replaced by a desperate animal. She lunged for the small, heavy flashlight I had placed on the park bench. I was quicker. I grabbed it first. The cold metal gave me a surge of power. It was Dad's, she screamed, her voice a raw sound of desperation. Unit 4B, it's gold, cash, years of untaxed profits. Mark was going to expose the Novachem scandal and use the profits for himself. I had to stop both of you, or the whole thing would fall apart. I kept the flashlight steady between us. You didn't have to kill anyone, Sarah. You chose to. And that choice was your mistake. I revealed the ultimate trap. The police aren't just looking for Victor, Sarah. They've been monitoring Mark's phone records since his collapse. And guess whose numbers showed up most frequently? Yours. The detective thinks you and Mark were planning the poisoning together. They think the Novachem link points to both of you trying to cover up Dad's crimes. Sarah stopped cold, the rage draining from her eyes, replaced with pure horror. She finally understood. I hadn't exposed her as the mastermind. I had intentionally allowed the police to see her as Mark's primary partner in the poisoning attempt, thereby making her my shield. I have the ledger's key, Sarah. You have the Unit 4B access codes. You and I are going to open that vault together. But understand this, if anything happens to me, the police already have a file detailing your intense jealousy and recent contacts with Mark. You'll be the only one left to face the music for the murder. She looked at the key, then at my face, the quiet sister she had always dismissed. The calculation returned, but this time it was laced with absolute submission. She knew she was trapped. I had swapped the poison in the Scotch. Now I had swapped the target in the family's game of survival.
The drive to the secret storage facility was silent, the air thick with mutual suspicion and absolute necessity. Sarah, pale and defeated, provided the access codes to the main entrance. We moved through the dimly lit corridors, finally stopping before the heavy steel door of Unit 4B. This was the epicenter of Dad's hidden life, and the reason my brother lay poisoned in a hospital bed. I inserted the gold JSL key, and Sarah entered the complicated 10-digit code on the pad. The lock clicked, and the door swung open, revealing not stacks of money or gold, but a meticulously organized office within the vault. It was a complete operations center, sterile and cold, clearly Victor Sterling's base of operations. In the center of the room was a large, bolted-down desk. Sarah immediately pointed to a shelf where she knew the hidden ledger was kept, a thick, unassuming book bound in dark leather. I snatched it up, my fingers flying to the first page. It wasn't a standard ledger. It was a complex log of chemical transfers, shell corporations, and, most disturbingly, a list of names. The list wasn't just old business partners. It detailed the funding of a small, highly exclusive mercenary group tied to political instability overseas. Our father hadn't just invested in a shady chemical company. He had been the silent financier for a volatile international operation, using the Novachem compound as a form of currency and control. Unit 4B was the nerve center for this shadow empire. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, pointing to a recent entry in the ledger, dated just days before the will reading. Mark hadn't just been investigating. He had been planning to leak the names on the ledger to the authorities, not to get the money, but to destroy Dad's criminal network and prove his own moral superiority. He wasn't a greedy heir. He was an enraged idealist who wanted to bring the truth down. Before I could fully process this, the cell phone I had been holding received a frantic text from Marcus, my PI. Victor is closing in on JSL. Get out now. The realization was immediate and terrifying. Victor knew the accelerate order failed, and he knew the Unit 4B codes were compromised.
He was coming to destroy the ledger and silence the last two witnesses. I hadn't just won the inheritance. I had inherited the responsibility for my father's most volatile, dangerous secret. Marcus's text message flared like a warning light in the darkness of the vault. Victor was close. The silence of the warehouse district was about to be broken by violence, and we were trapped with the one thing he was hunting for, the ledger. "He's coming," I hissed, shoving the book into a shoulder bag. "He was hired to clean this up. We have to move." Sarah, galvanized by the raw terror of the situation, finally proved useful. She pointed to a secondary unmarked door concealed by a shelving unit. "Emergency exit." Dad insisted on it. We burst out into the late afternoon air, running through a maze of dusty crates and shipping containers. Sarah, surprisingly quick, led the way, while I clung to the bag containing the ledger, the physical proof that our father was a criminal financier. As we reached the edge of the property, a sleek black car screeched to a halt in the driveway. Victor. He was a man built like a statue, with a chillingly calm expression that contradicted the urgency of his arrival. He didn't have to say a word. The cold, efficient way he moved confirmed that he was the specialist. He knew exactly what we had. "The book," Victor stated, his voice a low rumble. "Give it to me, and I might consider letting the less essential one live." His eyes fixed on me, knowing I was the primary threat. I shoved Sarah behind a loading dock pillar, giving myself 2 seconds to think. The fight wasn't about brute force, it was about leverage. I couldn't beat him, but I could threaten his entire operation. I pulled the ledger halfway out of the bag. "This book, Victor, it doesn't just contain Dad's accounting. It contains the names of every politician, every military contact, and every funding source in your entire network. You kill me, and this book goes public. You'll spend the rest of your life hunted by the very people you work for." I knew the police were looking for Victor Sterling, the consultant. They didn't know about his mercenary connections. But the ledger could instantly expose him as a target far more valuable to intelligence agencies than any local police department. The truth, carefully timed, was the only weapon I had against a man trained to kill.
Victor's calm demeanor cracked slightly. His eyes, fixed on the ledger protruding from my bag, confirmed my gamble. The book was more valuable to him than my life. Killing me meant exposing his network and destroying the very infrastructure that funded his operations. I had successfully turned the tables one last time. "You have 2 minutes to decide, Victor," I stated, keeping my voice steady despite the frantic pounding in my chest. "You walk away right now, and the ledger stays hidden. You try to take it, and I make sure a copy of this entire book is delivered to Detective Miller and every major news outlet in the country. Your clients will come for you long before the police do." He stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, his mind performing a rapid cost-benefit analysis. He glanced at Sarah, who was trembling behind the pillar, before finally turning his attention back to me. He realized the threat was genuine. My composure, coupled with the proven knowledge of the Novachem compound, convinced me I was not bluffing. With a barely perceptible shake of his head, Victor took a slow, deliberate step back toward his car. "This isn't over," he warned, his voice a low promise of future retribution. He entered the black vehicle, his silence a chilling acceptance of the terms. The car peeled away, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the dust and the terrifying silence in its wake. Sarah immediately collapsed, sobbing with relief, but I didn't let my guard down. I knew I couldn't trust her. The postscript. The following week, the will was finally settled. Mark, still in a coma, was removed from the will due to his critical, incapacitated state. Sarah, thoroughly broken by the fear of prison and exposure, signed over her portion of the liquid assets to a charity in Mark's name, then moved to a remote private estate,
effectively exiled by her own paranoia. The majority of the vast fortune, along with the family estate and all of its inherent dangers, fell to me. I never gave the ledger to the police. Instead, I carefully deciphered and digitized its contents. I used the hidden wealth to hire my own international security detail and bought Juno Security Logistics, bringing Dad's shadow organization under my own control. The Novachem secrets became my most potent defense. The detective eventually concluded the poisoning was an attempt by Mark to commit suicide by inheritance, driven mad by the stress and family conflict. A perfectly tidy, if false, narrative I had meticulously prepared. Sitting in Dad's study, no longer the quiet sister, but the sole heir and the new keeper of the family secrets, I looked out at the tranquil grounds. The money was mine, but it came with a lifetime of vigilance. The inheritance wasn't a fortune to spend. It was a fortress I had to build around myself. The game was over, but the watch had just begun.